As a leader, you're charged with evaluating the capabilities of people that work for you because you have to then pick out the ones with the greatest potential and make sure that they have the challenging opportunities to continue to grow. And then you can pick opportunities for them to have a greater leadership position. So you really can never fully understand that if you're doing their jobs for them. Right. So to some extent,
Yeah.
you've got to see what they can do. And the only way to do that is to give them the responsibility and let them accomplish it. So I think that's one piece of it.
Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today's episode is all about how leaders can ensure we're spending our time and energy on the things that only we can do. To help us unpack this critical leadership concept, I'm honored to welcome a true expert in leadership, U.S. Air Force General Ed Rice. General Rice's career is nothing short of extraordinary. A distinguished graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy and holder of 2 master's degrees, during Operation Enduring Freedom, he commanded bomber operations as the commander of the 28th Air Expeditionary Wing. He went on to become the commander of Air Education and Training Command, where he was responsible for shaping the future leaders of the Air Force. General Rice, thank you for joining me today on the Science of Leadership, and thank you for your service to our nation.
You bet. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, sir, let's get right after it with today's topic. When I interviewed you in the past for my study of 4-star officers, one of the big leadership lessons you share with me was that leaders really have to focus on those things that only we can do as leaders. What do you mean by that?
I think the real gist of that is, in my view, and there are lots of different definitions of leadership, and many of them are excellent, but I've come to hone in on this idea that the primary responsibility of a leader is to ensure that the right things are being done within the organization. There are a number of other people who can ensure that the right things are being done right. And quite frankly, in my experience, this idea of really charting the course of the organization, understanding all the internal and external factors that go into that sort of skill set and ability is more rare than the ability to actually execute once the direction has been determined. And so if you're a leader, I think your principal job is to chart the direction of the organization. And if you're spending your time doing other things that other people can do, then you're not really focusing on that area that only you can do. You're really ultimately responsible for deciding where are we going to head, right?
Yeah.
And so it's really just a matter of ensuring that you have the time and the ability to really chart the direction of the organization. And the only way to do that is to, I think, free up the time to do that and not sort of spend it doing other things. That's the gist of it. There are a lot of second order pieces to it, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Sure. How would you say this concept is different from just the idea of focus?
I think to some extent it's a subset of focus, right? I mean, you can focus on a lot of things. You can focus on somebody else's job, right? You can focus on something
Sure.
that has nothing to do with the purpose or the mission of the organization. So focus is, I think, a broad concept that says I'm going to now put my attention on something. I think this concept that we're talking about is what of all the things you could focus on should you focus on, and this sort of gets into those things that you've been empowered, right, to do.
Yeah. Well, thanks for clarifying that and putting in context this idea of doing only what we can do. So I was wondering, can you share a story from your career that really exemplifies what it looks like to do that?
Sure. When I sort of first started to think about this, and so there's sort of 2 pieces to this story. I was a wing commander, so I was a colonel, a fairly senior leader within the Air Force. I was in charge of a wing, a grouping of B-1 bomber aircraft. One Saturday morning, I got a call from my command post saying that the commander of the Pacific was en route to land on my base in 20 minutes, and I needed to meet him at the flight line. Scrambled, put on a uniform, got out there, and he explained to me that there had been an incident in the Pacific. He was in Washington, D.C. He was on his way back to the Pacific, to Hawaii, to his headquarters, and there had been an incident where a Chinese aircraft had run into a U.S. Air Force aircraft. International big incident.
Mm-hmm.
And he was trying to communicate on his aircraft, and the communication systems were not working well enough, right? So he kept getting cut off, kept getting dropped off. And when we were on the way to my office where he could get on a reliable, secure communication system, he mentioned to me how important it was for him as the leader to have clear communications, not only with the people who were working the problem, but the people who wanted to understand what was going on, namely the Secretary of Defense and the White House. And he said, when you get in a situation where people don't have a good understanding of what's going on in an emergency or a really important situation, they get really nervous, right? And they start to fill that white space with all sorts of ideas about what's happening, and usually they're not good, right? And so it's really important for you as a leader then to understand who needs to understand what's going on about a situation and ensure that they understand the basics of what's going on, so they have confidence that you know what that you're in charge of it and have control of it, right? He's the leader; he needs to have control of that situation. He needs to demonstrate that. So fast forwarding, not too long after that, I'm still in command of that same wing, and 911 happens, and we go to war. We deploy our unit to a place in the Indian Ocean. We're flying combat missions out of that location, and early one evening, somebody comes into my office and says, "I think we just lost a B-1 bomber," and that's highly unusual because the aircraft is got multiple redundancies, and you usually wouldn't lose one. And this happened on takeoff legs, so they had taken off and they were leaving, going to altitude, and that's when we lost contact with them. And so I went to the command post, thinking that probably this wasn't accurate information. One of the things you learn in leadership is first reports usually aren't true or accurate. But in this case, we in fact had lost the airplane on takeoff leg. And so when that happens, you convene your battle staff, which is all of the key personnel within the organization, into a command post area where you can command and control the situation. And so we did that. But to get to the point here, I determined at that point that because I had three external entities that were going to be interested in what was going on, I had my parent headquarters back in the continental United States, from which we were normally stationed, and that was my normal boss. I was situated in the Pacific Command area of responsibility. So there was a 4-star Air Force general who was responsible for the base that we were on. And then we were flying missions into Afghanistan. And so the commander who was in charge of those missions and tasking us was also interested in what was going on. So I knew there were going to be three people who were going to get information that an aircraft was down and wanted to know, sort of what was going on and why and how. And so what I did was I took my vice commander, my number two commander, and told him that he was responsible for running the internal aspects of this search and rescue operation. He was responsible for ensuring that the rest of the combat missions that we were flying would get off the ground and recovered. So I sort of put him in charge of the internal pieces of this because he was fully qualified and competent to do that. And I knew that the external people would want to hear from me, at least initially, about what was going on, what we were doing about it, how it was going to affect our operations. And so I focused externally, right? So 80% of my time was outside, 20% inside, monitoring his operations. And it worked great, right? And the feedback I got from my bosses was that they were very comfortable with the amount of information flow that they got and weren't tempted to, reach in and start asking questions and give me help that I didn't need during this situation. So that's just one example where you have to sort of determine who's best capable of doing what parts of an activity and dividing the work.
Yeah, this idea of doing only what only we can do is something I feel like I tend to have a knack for. My general approach is to find really good people, trust them to do the things they're good at, and delegate those things to them, and then empower them to get those things done. And so that really I feel like it frees me up to be able to focus on those things that I really do well. But in my career in life, I've seen a lot of people who seem to be unable to do that. And I have this hypothesis I'd like to kind of bounce off of you and get your
Sure.
thoughts, if you will. But basically what I've seen, and this happens time and again, is that someone in a leadership position who seems to be caught up doing other people's jobs. And in that, I've identified, I think, two big buckets of people who do that. The first is micromanager types who just don't seem to trust anybody to be able to do anything. And so there's that group. And then the second is what I would call would-be servant leaders. And so let me kind of expound on that a little bit, this idea of the would-be servant leader, because that's where my hypothesis has sort of developed. But I think there are a lot of people in leadership positions who don't know how to fulfill their role as the leader. So they revert to doing the jobs they know how to do, those jobs that they used to do, the jobs that their subordinates, those people that they're leading, are doing now. And they frame it, at least in their mind maybe, as servant leadership. I don't know if you've seen that, but I was just wondering, is there any, from your perspective and your experience, any legitimacy to this idea that maybe sometimes it isn't so much servant leadership as it is just reverting to the job that you know how to do?
No, I think that's absolutely true, and I would do that too. I think it's a natural tendency to do the things that you're comfortable with. Typically, you've done many of the jobs of people that work for you, and so either because you're comfortable in that area, you think you know it better. Oftentimes, sort of a piece of that is you have a very specific way of doing something or seeing information or accomplishing something. And that's the way you want it done, right? And so you're not necessarily open to another way that might be equally as good or even better because you're just comfortable with the way you're having it done, right?
Sure.
And so I think that's something that I always try to think about, right? How do I make sure that I'm not sort of inadvertently trying to mold things into a certain way that really isn't necessarily the best way or better than another way, right? And so I think this idea of what are you comfortable with, and are you sort of reverting to doing those things that you're comfortable with, or you were trying to say the only reason I have to do this is because somebody else can't do it the way that I want, is certainly a piece of this. And it's part of that self-awareness as a leader, I think, that we all need to have. And if you've got someone else who's sort of helping you to sort of open your aperture about what good is, what right is, that can be helpful too. So I absolutely agree. It's a big issue, and one that all of us as leaders confront.
Yeah. Well, maybe at some point I'll have to study that hypothesis a little bit. But okay, so now that we understand kind of on the big picture what it means to do only what only we can do as leaders, I'd like to answer the question, so what? That is, why is it really important from your perspective for leaders to do only what only we can do?
I think there are a number of reasons for that, and not necessarily in any priority order. But for one, you have to, as a leader, you're charged with evaluating the capabilities of people that work for you, right? Because you have to then pick out the ones with the greatest potential and make sure that they have the challenging opportunities to continue to grow. And then you can pick opportunities for them to have greater leadership positions. So you really can never fully understand that if you're doing their jobs for them, right? So to some extent,
Yeah.
you've got to see what they can do, and the only way to do that is to give them a responsibility and let them accomplish it. So I think that's one piece of it. I think there's another piece of it that's associated with that where people resent you. Many people, and I think the best people, resent you doing their jobs for them, right? You,
Sure.
you give them a job, and then your hands are all over it, and they never really get a chance to do it. There's just sort of an environment that you create in an organization. You kind of mentioned it in terms of how you approach this, and you try to pick the right people and empower them and give them an opportunity to do the job that you've hired them for. That's very energizing for people, right? To have that race, it can be scary to some extent for people to know that they're sort of on the horse by themselves. But the best people, that's what they want, that's what they expect, and they're going to resent if you are sort of micromanaging the work that they do. Sort of again, a subset of that is at some point people just start to not really perform because they know that you're expecting that someone else is going to, sort of
Yeah.
micromanage what they're doing, and so you never get the best performance out of them. I think it's also important because of the velocity of work that you need to have to go through an organization, right?
Mhm.
So if you're the roadblock, if you're taking twice, three times as long to get information through you, because a lot of that information doesn't need to come through you, it could go someplace else and get done more quickly, then just sort of the velocity of output of the organization gets slowed down. And
Mhm.
so, you need, and it's another sort of lesson that I learned from one of the leaders that I work for, who said, he'd have to be on his deathbed for him not to turn over all of the work that he had, within 24 hours, because he knew that would keep the velocity of activity in the organization moving. And it's something that I adopted, right? I mean, well, there'd be a rare occasion where I didn't turn something that was on my desk in 24 hours because it's just a way of making a more efficient and effective
Mhm.
organization. And one of the only ways you can do that, again, is to focus on those things that you're responsible for and not take on work that someone else is trying to do. And then I think the last, and I said these aren't in priority order, but if I were to put one at the top of the priority list, it gets back to sort of where we started with this, where as a leader, you really have to spend your time thinking about what right is, right?
Mhm.
What are the things that we need to do? Not we did it 2 years ago or last year, and so we're comfortable with that. That's a process of constant evaluation of the external environment, of the internal performance, and understanding when you make adjustments, right?
Mhm.
To what you're doing. And so you really have to free up the time to be able to do that. And I think those would be four reasons why I think this concept is really important in an organization.
Yeah. Thanks for delineating those. They're all compelling. I think this is one of those ideas. At least to me, it's one of those ideas that I don't think people have really thought about. But once you hear it, it just sort of, for most people at least, makes intuitive sense. I think it was General Tom Hill who first hit me with this idea of doing what only you can do. And after that, there were a number of you all whom I interviewed who talked about it. And it's just it's just this sort of straightforward idea. And the way I think about it is very simply, if you spend all your time doing everybody else's job, you won't have time to do your job as a leader.
Right.
And so if you don't do your job as a leader, then the mission will not be accomplished. So in my mind, it's that simple. Anyway, that's kind of.
I think you're right, but oftentimes the simple becomes hard to actually do in real life because there are lots of reasons. We talked about some of them. You're comfortable doing somebody else's job. You just sort of get lost in the work and don't realize that you're doing someone else's job. Again, just in terms of time management, and it happens to all of us. If I ever felt like I don't have enough time on my calendar to do, my calendar's full, and I'm not enough time in the day, I then go back and look and say, what's on here that somebody else should be doing, right?
Yeah.
Why am I in this meeting? Why am I looking at this? And inevitably, there are things that you can clear off and create space for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I think some people, it's almost like they have this guilt of distributing those things to other people. I don't know. That seems to hold them back maybe, but.
Well, I think we're into a different topic now to some extent of time management, but there are lots of people that have different ways of thinking about this, but I've seen it where the idea of sort of being busy, right?
Mhm.
The idea of working, 12, 14-hour days in and of itself is considered to be somehow a strength or a positive, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in my view, it's really the opposite. There's always more work to do, right? I mean, you could
Right,
fill
right.
24 hours a day if you wanted to.
Yeah.
The trick is not to work, 14 hours. The trick is to ensure that you are working on the most important things and that you've sort of organized it such that you spend your time on the most important things. And if you do that right and well, there's never been a job that I've ever had. Doesn't matter what the level is, doesn't matter sort of what the level of responsibility was, where I felt like I had to work, 12-hour days, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you can work 12-hour days, you can work 10-hour days. If you can work 10-hour days, you can figure it out, right?
Yeah.
How to sort of organize yourself in your work to get what you need to get done if you're focused on the right things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is, I think, an important just sort of concept within an organization to sort of let other people understand the importance of this concept so that you sort of have the right work environment within the organization.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yes, sir. Earlier, you shared what it looks like for, a story from your career, what it looks like to do this. Is there one that you can think of from your career where it actually was really important, like critical that you were doing only, or someone else that you saw only what you could do?
Maybe another example would be when I was the commander of Air Education and Training Command, as you indicated.
Mm-hmm.
We had a situation with basic military training where, to make a long story short, we got indications that one of the trainers had been involved with an inappropriate sort of relationship situation with one of the trainees, right?
Mm.
And then we sort of got a subsequent report that maybe three other trainers had been involved separately in this type of very unwanted and unacceptable activity.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, it was still something that wasn't going to necessarily sort of ring any bells externally. You're in a large organization, things happen that you don't want to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But as we started to investigate this, it became clear to me that it was going to be more than three, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because of the nature of it, it was clear to me based on my experience that this was going to be a big deal. And to make a long story short, it ended up being a big deal where we had congressional hearings. I'm briefing the
Mm.
White House. I'm doing press conferences. It's in the news, so it's a national news story.
Yeah.
And at some point, I decided that I would make the sort of two-star commander of the numbered Air Force, of the sort of big entity that was responsible for training, sort of the face of this externally, right?
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was the appropriate level. He had enough gravity to do it. But it became very clear to me up front that it actually needed to be me, the four-star commander, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who had overall responsibility for this activity, that really had the experience. I had experience with a number of tangential situations, who had the sort of gravity of rank
Sure. Mm-hmm.
to be the external face of this, and that nobody else could really do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this was a case where I decided that, of the things that I was going to focus on for the foreseeable future, this was one of them. I was the only person that could really sort of represent the situation in the right way externally, and I delegated other parts of it to other people. So I think that's, again, as a leader, there are times where you have to decide, this needs to be me. Sometimes we call it, in the military, you have action officers who are basically the staff officers who do a lot of the analysis and
Mhm.
development of alternatives. They do the staff work in an
Yeah.
organization. They're typically mid-level people. But sometimes, as a leader, you have to be a four-star action officer. You have to decide. In this situation, I actually have to get down into the details of it.
Mhm.
I'm reminded of Colin Powell during the Iraq War, the lead up to the Iraq War, where there was this discussion about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and he
Mhm.
needed to go to the United Nations to make the case that we thought that they weren't there. And he decided that he needed to be sort of, the Secretary of State action officer and go to the CIA and other intelligence agencies and actually do the work himself, so that he was comfortable with, what was he was going to present, and not rely on others to give it to him. So that was
Mhm.
when, as a leader, he decided his time was well spent
Yeah.
in a fairly, low level type of work. So I think those are the types of decisions as a leader you have to make. It's not only important to delegate, but it's
Mhm.
also important to understand where you can't delegate something, and,
Sure.
and you have to be the person that takes that responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important. A really important leadership lesson is that there's certainly we want to try to delegate as much as possible, but there's certainly times and things when this is the leader's job. This is why you're in the role that you're in, and you have to take that on and handle it.
Yeah, I think another, just thought about this, and again, I learned so much of what I know from other people. I saw a very senior leader every once in a while when you had a staff meeting and people would brief. Typically, he, in this case, was at the head of the table taking the briefing. Every once in a while, he'd take the microphone and he would give the briefing, right? And only to demonstrate to others, how you could effectively brief a senior officer, right? And he was very effective at it, and it was very much a learning experience for everyone, and it helped both shape the information that he was giving, but teach other people, right?
Mhm.
The most effective way to do something. So there are times, again, similar to what I was saying before, where from a teaching perspective, you might do something that someone else can do, right? But with
Sure.
the objective of making everybody better, right?
Yeah. As I thought about, I try to think about examples of this, and I've seen where, where people have gotten this right. I thought of all sorts, and then, in medicine, perhaps because they're naturally helpers who do a lot of other people's jobs, never really do what only they can do. But instead of talking about specific situations like that and places where people have gotten it wrong, I was thinking maybe for listeners, an example that might be helpful is just thinking about corporations that have gotten it wrong, as to serve as a surrogate for this idea. And so I was thinking about that, and Sears and Roebuck came to mind. So, during the first half of the 20th century, Sears just absolutely dominated retail and department stores and so forth. But then in the mid 20th century, they started getting into other areas. Like they got into insurance with Allstate, they got into real estate with Coldwell Banker, and they got into credit services with Discover Card. And so they put more effort and money into those areas that weren't really for them. And then as a result, things have not panned out so well. And when I was a kid, we would go and I would get that's where I'd get pants for school. We'd go buy a couple of these pants and pairs of pants, and Sears was just too big in my mind to fail. But I think now they're bankrupt, right? Like they don't essentially don't exist anymore, certainly not in the way that they did. And I think that a big part of that, from my perspective, as I could see, is that they started doing other things. They started doing other people's jobs. They didn't do the thing that only they could do, really. And so that was an example, I think, that really stood out to me for a corporation that didn't get that right and how it had a negative impact on them. Usually this is the point in the episode where I share the scientific studies that have been done on our discussion topic, but as far as I can find, no one has actually studied this particular concept as really important and kind of obvious, I guess, as it is. There's studies that explored components of it. For instance, Zhang and colleagues found delegation increased psychological empowerment in employees, and Matthew and colleagues showed that employee empowerment is essential for organizational effectiveness, but there just really aren't meaningful data, at least that I can find, on this topic. But among you all, among the 4 stars that I studied, 20 of you either spoke specifically about doing only what only you can do, at least did that, or tangentially kind of discussed it. So it seems pretty clear that that's an important topic, even though no one has studied it yet. Maybe at some point we'll figure out how to study it, but maybe it's an operationalization issue at this point.
Yeah, I think I don't know of any studies either, so I can't point you to any. I do think that this somewhat is not unique, but definitely specific to the military sort of organizational construct. So in
The
every
idea, you mean?
very well, I mean the idea of the leader focusing on leading, right, and having someone
Mhm.
else that's focusing on execution, right. And so in almost every military organization in every country, because they're based on a similar model,
Sure.
you have a leader, but you have someone who's essentially an operations officer. Right, and their role is to make sure that the trains run on time while the leader decides where the trains are going to go, right?
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily true, outside the military. You'll see it in some places, but in other places you won't. Oftentimes you'll see the leader who's really responsible for both, overall sort of direction setting and execution. And you don't necessarily have a person whose primary responsibility is to make sure that the organization is accomplishing what it needs to accomplish in an efficient, effective manner. I'm not saying one's better than the other, but I do think that all military people would sort of look at this in the same way. It's not surprising to me that as you
Mhm.
interviewed a number of us, we all had this same sort of concept in mind because it's part of the culture I think that we come up in.
Sure. Yeah. That makes plenty of sense. My hope is that maybe listeners can take things from, what we're talking about, that derive from military background, and situations and apply them more broadly. So certainly, as we're thinking about this, we talked about the concept, what it is, why it's important. General Rice, are there certain practical steps that you have that could help our listeners, think about how to do this well, how to go about identifying those things that really are unique tasks for them versus how are empowering the other people that they lead?
Yeah, I would say, and again, some of this is somewhat, focused just on sort of the military context, because if you're a leader, you know that you're only going to be in that position 2 or 3 years, right? And then you're going to move somewhere else. Not necessarily so in a private sector, type of a context where you could be in a leadership position for many, many years. And so you might think about, how do you organize yourself in that position a little bit differently when you know you're going to get someplace and the clock is ticking sort of fairly quickly from the day that you step in. But I think this is broadly applicable. What I got in the habit of doing when I took on a new leadership role was to conduct a review, a pretty extensive review of that organization and what we're responsible for outputting, right?
Mhm.
And to whom, right? And such that not only I, but it was good for everybody to sort of review everything that we should be doing, and then sort of evaluating how we think we're doing, on those things. And almost invariably, there were things on there that could be identified as, well, we were supposed to do this 10 years ago, but it's really not applicable anymore, but we're still doing it. Or, well, we're supposed to do this, but we're only doing it at about half the level of quality that we should be doing it, right? And so it sort of gives you a baseline to understand where we are as an organization, who's depending on what we produce, what the output of what we do is, how well are we meeting our basic mission and objectives now. And then you go through another exercise that lays on top of that, that says, okay, who's responsible for each one of these pieces, each one of these outputs, and how are we organized to accomplish those activities. I'm very big on ensuring that responsibility, authority, and accountability are aligned. It was
Mhm.
one of the lessons that I was told as I was leaving the Air Force Academy. When you graduate, people tap you on the shoulder and they want to give you sage advice. And a senior person said, make sure throughout your career that you get that piece right. Responsibility, accountability, and authority, because there'll be all sorts of times where people get those misaligned and it's usually not going to end up well, right? And so it's a lesson that I have taken. And so I think going through that exercise of ensuring that you understand what needs to be done and that you've got responsibility, accountability, authority aligned, then lends itself to you being able to now say, okay, not only do I know what I'm responsible for, what I need to focus on, but all of my key leaders know that well, right? And know that as well. And I have found through feedback that people who have given me, that have worked for me, they really appreciate that clarity, right? Of what do you expect of me? Have I given you the authority to do it? And now I can hold you accountable for these things, and there's not a lot of ambiguity around that. And so I think that's one practical sort of way to
Mhm.
think about it. Just clean house, take stock of it all and
Yeah.
sort of clean it up. I already talked to sort of about the calendar review, and just
Mhm.
I think all of us can look at our calendar and look and say, why am I doing that, right? When Jane or Joe can be doing that. And I also think it's important to check with your subordinates in this, in this context. And by that I
Mhm.
mean, like, for example, um, I can recall when I went to one of my people that worked for me, fairly senior, because I knew that I had given him a lot. right, that I'd put a lot on his plate.
Mhm.
And so I told him, look, I know I've given you a lot. If you feel like, I've given you more than you can practically handle here, you need to, you need to let me know, because I'd rather you tell me that than sort of, flounder with overloaded work. That's my job, right? And his initial reaction was, hey, I can do it all, right? He sort of took it as a sign of weakness if he were to admit to me that I had given him too much. And I had to explain to him that's not, my job is to make sure that the right amount of the workload is in the right places, and I'm not underloading or overloading people. And the only way I can do that is sort of with this kind of a conversation, and it's not a sign of weakness, for us to have a conversation about where that goes. And so it was a more useful conversation. And so I say that just to say this whole concept of where is the work, and are people appropriately empowered to do the work and resourced to do the work, and have you thought about how much time they have to do the work, is just a really important concept in organizational fitness.
Mhm.
And again, because I have seen it work where that sort of check hasn't been done, and you've got people that are struggling because their leader has not really appropriately divided the work, or they're asking them to do too much, or they haven't asked them to do enough. It's not their fault. It's my fault, right?
Sure. Well, thanks for those. Those are helpful. As I was going through the analysis of from the 4 stars that I interviewed and looking at this, as this bubbled up in the writing of my book and things, I identified what I would say are 5 must do's if leaders are going to be able to do only what only they can do, and those split into things regarding the leader and the led, if you will. First, for ourselves, you have to understand the mission and your role in it. Second, I've talked about this a bunch in other episodes. You have to understand your personal strengths and weaknesses. What can you do? What can't you do very well? And then as we turn to those things for those that we lead, there are 3 things. 1, trust your people. 2, delegate important components of the mission to them. And 3, empower them to accomplish those important things you delegated to them. And those, you covered those in a number of ways throughout the conversation. And then there with the practical things, I like to try to make it condensed and portable for folks, but those are the 5 things I identified through the different responses and comments that I got from you all during the interview study.
No, spot on. Can't add or detract. Sounds right to me.
Well, General Rice, before we wrap up here, I wanted to ask you if you could go back to your earlier years as a leader, what's one piece of advice you'd give yourself?
I think for me early on, I didn't really understand how, with a leader, you have the power to say yes. So it sort of gets back to, oftentimes the leader's position is the one that has the opportunity to determine when an internal rule or policy doesn't apply to that situation, and we're going to go against it, right? Other people, they get paid to follow the rules. There are a few people that get paid to interpret when the rules don't apply, and to do something different.
Yeah.
And I kind of came up as a rule follower. I mean, I sort of made my early career because I knew all of the rules
Mhm.
really well, and I could execute them well, and that was valued within an organization.
Yeah.
But then at some point you transition to a leader, and your job is to interpret again, sort of when you need to sort of be in a different place on the rules. Maybe a different another way to sort of get to this point is with respect to rules and lines.
Mhm.
There are basically 3 types of people, right? There are people who want to know where the lines are so they can stay as far away from them as possible because they don't
Mhm.
want to sort of get in any sort of problem. That's one group of people. You've got another group of people who want to know where the lines are so they can get as close to them as possible, right?
Right.
Without going over them. And then you have another group of people who say, lines, rule, that those are for somebody else, right? And they
Yeah.
don't pay much attention to them. And all of those people can be useful, right, in an
Sure.
organization. But you really have to understand what type of person you're dealing with, so that you don't put the wrong type of person in the wrong type of a situation. And I would dare say you could probably decide which person you are in that group, and you could probably take everybody that and say that's a rule follower, that's a person who wants to get low, and this is a person who doesn't care much about life. And so it's a very powerful sort of framework
Mhm.
to think about how you organize teams, how you organize your organization. And so I think it's sort of just another way of, as a young leader, I needed to sort of understand a little bit better both this power that I had to say yes, not
Mhm.
just follow the rules, right? And how do you think about other people within an organization and what their characteristics are, and how do you put them in the best position to not only help them be successful, but help the organization be successful? You probably need, 60% of your people to be rule followers, right? And maybe 20% to be people who are working along the edges to really push the organization forward, and maybe 2% out of the box people who are always coming up with crazy ideas, right? So
Yeah, that's spectacular advice. I think that's a great way to end out our conversation today on this episode. So, General Rice, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and experiences with us on the podcast today. It's been an honor to have you on the Science of Leadership.
I enjoyed it. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.